Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started now, and I imagine there will be people filing in, finishing up their last sips of coffee. We're very pleased to have with us today to talk about the North American Natural Gas Resource Base. Christopher Schenck, he's the project chief at the USGS for the USGS National Oil and Gas Assessment. This assessment is actually incredibly valuable to us for the modeling work we do here at the Baker Institute. We use all of the data that they provide, not only on a national level, but we also use the World Resource Assessment in developing our own World Natural Gas Trade Model, which I'll discuss later today. But pleased to introduce Chris.
Thank you, Ken. Let's see. The system's set up for right-handed people, I see. They say after you turn 50, you can only be mildly surprised anymore. And I've been mildly surprised 3 times already today. One is I managed to get December on my slide here. And the second one is the weather. The weather out here is beautiful. The third one I'll talk about in a few minutes, my other mild surprise of the day. I'm going to very briefly talk about the U.S. National Oil and Gas Assessment. The first thing I'll do is go through the goals of how we do the assessment, some definitions which we always seem to have to bring up as words are important and we use them differently and we try and get that used consistently. I'm going to key on our assessment methodology. As I give this talk around the country, I've found that more and more people are asking questions about, okay, that's your number, how did you get it? So I'm going to key on the methodology. I'm not saying they believe it, they ask how we get it. And finally, I'll do a brief summary on the U.S. natural gas. I'm not going to talk about Canada. That was already discussed earlier, and I'll just say something very briefly about Mexico. Our goal is to take a bunch of geologists and come up with hypotheses on the quantities of oil and gas that have the potential to be added to the reserve base in the U.S. That word potential is key to us. That means we are looking at resources and not reserves. The USGS has a responsibility for the onshore and state waters portion of the U.S. We also have responsibility for priority basins worldwide, asked for by several other agencies in the U.S. government. The MMS, the Minerals Management Service, has a responsibility for the U.S. federal waters. So in the USGS, I can assess Cuba, North Korea, Libya, wherever, but I can't touch the U.S. federal waters. That's the purview of the MMS. As far as resources versus reserves, this is a key point to us, and it's key for us when we talk to people in Congress. The congressional people seem to switch seats very rapidly. All the staff has rapid turnover, so we're constantly going out over these terms. Just to let you know that the USGS responsibility is for assessing undiscovered resources, which is this blue box on this thing. We don't do reserves. Reserves are the purview of the Department of Energy. We don't do economics either. We have all we can do with geology. The economics are left for people like the people here at the Baker Institute. The goal of the national assessment in the U.S., we look at priority basins, is approximately 70 provinces in the U.S., geologic provinces. About 42 produce oil and gas. We've prioritized about 32 of those, which contain about 96% of the known resources. As geologists, we chase after the petroleum systems, which are the fluids in these basins, and the assessment units are plays, which are the rocks. So we have a bunch of guys and just chase after the fluids and rocks. And in the end of that, we have to somehow on paper come up with numbers that are somehow backed up by the geology. We assess both conventional and continuous resources. The word continuous is something we put in there to replace the word unconventional. And finally, economics are not included, and that's an important point that's lost as we deal with Congress. They think we do economically recoverable resources, and we don't do that. One of the interesting things that happened in the year 2000 was for the first time, after 30 years of doing these assessments, there was a law stuck in place called EPCA, where it said, it actually named us to do these assessments basically aimed at assessing oil and gas on the federal lands. And again, you can see they use the word reserve in here rather than resources, which is a real problem. But for the first time, there was a law in place that said we had to do this on a regular basis and provide these estimates to the congressional committees. And that's what we're working under presently. And then, much to my surprise, in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, someone stuck a paragraph in there that said we had to use the same assessment methodology across all basins, which, for someone to put that grain in there, was very interesting to us. We don't know yet who did that, but it's very interesting. With that EPCA Act, our role is to produce technically recoverable numbers. We work with BLM, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, and DOE on this. We do it regardless of land status, and then we hand those over. This is my position. I have to hand those assessments over to BLM, where they take those numbers and then do the EPCA analysis. They do the drilling restrictions and all that. And this is where I had my mild surprise this morning. When we did the initial EPCA study, the phase 1, the first 6 basins of EPCA, there was only one where there was a lot of restrictions. That was the Montana Thrust Belt. The rest of them didn't seem to have much in the way of restriction, but this morning I heard that only 17% of the resource was available, and I don't think that's right, but I could be wrong about that. For the status where we are now, the red basins, this is not a political statement. This is simply the basins we've assessed so far. The green ones are the basins we will assess in the next few years. That will encompass all the major onshore and state water resources in the United States. Again, we don't have the jurisdiction to do the offshore. These are the basins we'll do in the next few years that will finish this latest round of basins for we call the 2,000 plus assessment. The methodology, it's important. You simply have to know how we arrive at these numbers. We have conventional gas resources and what we call continuous gas resources. Those are the ones like tight gas sands, basin-centered gas, gas shales, coal bed gas, gas and chalks. So we have these 2 main categories of resources and hence 2 main assessment methodologies to cope with that. And again, we use the word continuous because it's geologic. Unconventional, we started to have problems with the congressional committees in that you use conventional wells to get at this stuff. Why do you call it unconventional? So we went to a more geologic definition. I'm not going to say much about hydrates. We're about to do the first assessment of hydrates on the North Slope of Alaska. That will be done in about the next 6 months. And again, my job as project chief is to take a bunch of geologists and try and wrestle how much uncertainty they're dealing with in these assessments. It's a big task, especially with geologists who can never agree on anything. Just to get at this conventional versus continuous resource, conventional oil and gas fields to us, if you look at this diagram, are discrete entities where the oil or gas is buoyant upon water. That's our definition of what a conventional oil or gas field is. So you can see it's just like salad dressing, right? Water, oil, maybe gas. So you can see the conventional structural accumulations, stratigraphic accumulations, but the hydrocarbon is sitting above a water column. But there's this big class of resources that we call continuous that are very diffuse across basins, regionally, and geologically we go to that continuous term. And again, that's basin-centered gas, tight gas, gas shales, coal bed methane. So we use a very different methodology to assess those. So again, very different geology, very different methodology. And you have to know that as you go into the assessment process and know what those numbers truly mean. For conventional oil and gas fields, we come at this with a size and number methodology. We know the field sizes of existing fields. We use that as guides to what possibly could be found in the future. Most conventional gas resources in the U.S., as we assess it, are mainly focused in the Gulf Coast and Alaska. One of the ways we show the results of these assessments to the congressional committees is the use of these bubble maps, which they seem to like because they're so visual. The key here is big bubble is good, little bubble bad. So you can see the big bubbles are Alaska and the two main provinces in the Gulf Coast. Permian Basin, Anadarko, and a few others, you can see some fairly high numbers. But in general, across the U.S., you leave those two regions, and conventional gas resources really aren't that important. And if you add an economic cut to this, this is technically recoverable, and these are mean numbers. You stick economics on top of this, and what's recoverable in Alaska goes to zero. All that North Slope, big red blobs disappear. And so instead of approximately 300 TCF, economically you're down a third to a half of that. So the economics takes a big chop on what we interpret as technically recoverable gas resources, the conventional gas resources in the U.S. For the continuous accumulations, these are coal bed methane, tight gas, gas shales, even hydrates. We use a very geologic definition of the assessment units, and then we go at this with an engineering approach. We'd look at well production performance, decline curves of wells, drainage areas of wells, and try and come up with a very data-based and data-grounded assessment methodology. So again, one that will produce numbers that are certainly technically recoverable numbers. These are not in place numbers. And again, every quantity here is uncertain. And again, my job is to define that uncertainty and get the spread of the results as large as I possibly can to cover every base. Again, what we do is we come at this play area or assessment unit area. They have to define that. That's a problem. We look at drainage areas of wells. We need wells that aren't interfering with each other when they produce. It's a very difficult quantity to come up with. Well production and performance, we look at the estimated ultimate recoveries of wells, come up with distributions of that. So we have a distribution of estimated recovery, a distribution of drainage areas, and error on the definition of the play or assessment unit. Put all that together in an analytical solution to come up with volumes of resources. I'll very quickly go through this. This looks like Saturn, but it's actually a map view of a play. Again, uncertainty on all these unit definitions. A geologist will love to draw that blue solid line, but in reality there's quite a bit of error on that. The assessment units are based on reservoir performance of wells. There's production sweet spots that you have to separate out. And outside of those, the EURs, the wells usually do worse. And a good example of that is the Barnett Shale here in Texas. And the Barnett Shale is the Newark East Field, which is a real sweet spot in that continuous regional accumulation. All the wells do far better there than they do outside of that, so we assessed the Newark East separately from the bigger Barnett Shale play. Drainage areas of cells, another problem area. There's an ideal well drainage where the rock is allowing the fluids to move into the well bore, but a typical well drainage is dependent upon that geology, and it can range from, we do this in acres, from 10 to hundreds of acres. We look for means, we look for distributions on all these quantities. It's a very difficult thing to quantify, particularly since stimulation techniques vary so widely. You have vertical versus horizontal wells, and you have all various types of horizontal wells, whether they're single or multiples. All this gets factored into our EUR distributions and determination of acreages of drainage areas. The EURs are based on existing data. Again, very data intensive, and that's applied play to play so that we actually have a grounding in data on these assessments. I'm not going to go through the EUR distributions, but suffice to say that this isn't a Karnak approach to do the assessment. It's actually based on wells within the assessment units. I'm not going to go through that calculation. If you look at the continuous gas resource in the U.S., again, big red bubbles, good. It changes from the Gulf Coast in Alaska to the Rockies. You can see the big tight gas sand plays in the Rockies drive those big red bubbles, both in the Wyoming basins, Uinta, San Juan. The Appalachian's a big player here. Michigan Basin has some. But we very recently assessed the Permian Basin and came up with a big red dot there. A lot of uncertainty on that number. And again, the Fort Worth Basin with its big red dot in the Barnett Shale. But you can see the change. When you look at continuous, it's really changed to the Rockies and other basins from Alaska and the Gulf Coast. If you look at coal bed methane around the country, see really driven by the San Juan, Powder River, Appalachian, and Black Warrior basins. And again, this is supposedly technically recoverable. This is not saying that all this is economically producible. The Uinta in particular is one where, coming from Colorado, it's become a real issue in the state of recovering this gas. 21 TCF at the mean. There's quite a spread on that number. 21 TCF is a lot of gas to be produced from western Colorado. There's lots of wells being drilled in this area. One of the things that happens with this continuous gas, the one that's regional, is you need lots of wells. The wells aren't that good. They're usually gridded off at some spacing, and hundreds, perhaps thousands, tens of thousands, excuse me, of wells are needed. And that's the issue at the moment in the Piceance Basin. Federal land's on a very big issue, but just the sheer numbers of wells that have to be drilled is the issue. The same occurs in southwest Wyoming. This was the focus of the EPCA federal land law. Tight gas sands are a major issue out there, and there's estimates of, multiple tens of thousands of wells required if they want to recover that gas. 85 TCF at the mean. It's a lot of gas in any basin. It's the biggest one in the Rockies. Just to quickly go through the U.S. resource summary. For conventional gas, as I mentioned, it's approximately 300 TCF. There's quite a bit of error on that number. But if you do the economic cut, you really remove that stuff in northern Alaska. And that includes the new assessments were done of both NPRA, ANWR, and Central North Slope. So you can imagine that being cut in about half if you really want to put an economics cut on that. Again, conventional gas really, really favored in both Alaska and the Gulf Coast. Just to put that number in perspective, I think, if I remember right, the MMS assessment for the Gulf Coast, the federal water assessment, was approximately 200 TCF, if I remember right. Offshore eastern U.S. is about 30 TCF. We have a total continuous gas assessment of about 360 TCF. And again, that's technically recoverable. And of that 360, 80 to 90 is coal bed, and the rest is tight gas. Now again, just if you run through the calculation, just take the mean EURs of wells in both coal bed and tight gas, shale gas, chalk gas, and you need lots of wells. And that's the main difference between it and conventional recovery. That's the U.S. I just want to say a few minutes worth of what we've done in the biggest gas basin in Mexico. In 2003, I worked with Pemex to look at the geology of the Burgos Basin. We defined 5 assessment units or plays in the Burgos. Of course, it's linked to the Gulf Coast. The geology just crosses right across the border. We assessed the mean conventional accumulation there, about 13 TCF at the mean. Conventional associated gas, about 7 TCF, and that's the gas offshore associated with the oil. We very recently assessed the coal bed methane potential in part of the Burgos and put about 200 BCF at the mean for coal bed. Again, none of this has an economic cut on it. So you could expect something less than these numbers if you were really going after the economics. Just a map of the Burgos Basin. We define the Burgos probably a little differently than most people. We have the onshore portion, but we also assess the Mexican ridges offshore. And surprisingly enough, we put quite a bit of oil offshore with its associated 7 TCF of gas. But the 13 TCF onshore turns out that it's approximately the same as the Pemex assessment. So we felt pretty good about that. But I don't think, well, I probably shouldn't say anything about where the gas is going to end up, but I don't think that's part of the gas that will end up in any sort of U.S. mix. Interesting, when I was doing this study with Pemex, I would stay in, what's the town, McAllen, Texas? Is there McAllen? And walk across the bridge to Reynosa every day. But the Americans made me walk through a turnstile and put a quarter in every day. It was very strange. Just to sum this up, I hope I've impressed upon you that we have these 2 main categories of assessments for gas and oil both. This conventional and continuous. Both very different methodologies, both grounded in data, however. Our focus has been on continuous gas in the U.S., and it will continue to be over the next few decades. Conventional gas, once you leave Alaska and Gulf Coast, has just really flattening out. The trick with the continuous gas, as I mentioned, is the colossal number of wells required to produce this gas. And that's where you run into problems of who owns the land, what kind of animals and plants are on the land, what time of the year it is, and which species are around. It's a real problem when you're talking about needing hundreds of thousands of wells. And it also gets into the issue of how much time is required to produce gas from wells where you need to probably drill 50,000 of them. Anyway, that's the whole issue with continuous gas. Again, just to reiterate, we're doing technically recoverable only. Economics are not included. And if you want your eyes to bleed, just go to our website and you can download as much of this as you'd like. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. Okay. Lots of hands went up all at once.
Chris, I'm concerned about long-term policy decisions based upon your work. And 15 years ago, the Barnett Shale in the Fort Worth Basin was not technically recoverable, but after our industry spent and wasted probably millions of dollars, we figured out how to technically recover it. Was that part of a potential resource base? And really my big question is, are we significantly understating our resource base in terms of based upon the application of technology as well as economics in terms of really getting to it?
No, that's fair enough. Did everyone hear that? John said that was the best presentation he's ever heard, and no, do we underestimate the resource? Yeah, probably, and the reason for that is we use today's technology, and we can't anticipate what's going to happen in 20 years, or any Star Trek type technology, and we certainly see that with things like the Barnett. In fact, the USGS assessment in 1995 didn't even include the Barnett. And it's been done since then. So that's absolutely true. But I think with time we're getting better at it. We're including all the gas shales, for instance, now, all the tight gas sands, where 10 years ago we didn't do that. But there is that possibility. Because we know we're doing something right when we're told our assessments are too high and half the people say they're too low. So we're probably doing something right anyway. Sure.
I was surprised by one of your comments.
That's because you're under 50. That's your.
I'm usually in the mean. I was surprised, though I understand that USGS does not do economics. You made a very, what I would consider, strong remark in stating that the resources in Alaska are not, the bubble, the big red bubble would disappear if you considered economics. And just like to clarify, or if you could please clarify that, because I'm surprised, because we do see a lot of project proponents drilling, exploring, and I'm sure considering a major possibility now. Of course, without a pipeline in place in the short term, but it doesn't mean it's not economic. It's currently, I guess the state considers it stranded. But I'd just like you, if you could expand upon that.
Yeah, I probably should say I'm fundamentally ignorant of economics. That should take care of the answer right there. But I mean, for all the discussions about that pipeline, right? Until that's in place, what can you do? The gas is stranded there, right? Unless you tanker it out somehow. So economics in that sense. Now, I'm sure if you made a cost-supply function, you'd see what's economic. We haven't done that. You guys probably have done that here. But I'll bet those bubbles get much smaller, whatever analysis you do on that. That's probably what I should have said. Thank you for saying that. Appreciate that. Yes?
Yeah. Has any thought, or when you do your estimates, do you look first at the initial in place and then make some estimate of recovery?
No.
If you do, well, because one of the key things that's happening, of course, with technology and happening as the industry evolves is it improves recovery factors. So when you say technically recoverable resources, then you're not, that's going to change over time. You say we're getting better, but you aren't really getting better. The industry is getting better at recovering more. And it seems like it would be extremely helpful if, as geologists, you would say, this is the initial in place, and this is the recovery we assumed. And it would really, I think, clarify a lot of issues.
Except that we've found over the last 30 years that the in-place number changes. And that's come out of our studies of reserve growth, the inferred reserves, that we do in cooperation with DOE. That number is changing, field by field, so you can't lock in on an in-place number, because that moves. So what we did with our methodology was go with just the known resource, recoverable plus the reserve number that we have available to us. We don't use the in-place, because that turns out to be as squirrely as anything else. So we just haven't done that. We don't base our assessments on an in-place number. And in fact, that's true of the continuous also. We try to get away from in-place with a continuous. For example, someone at one point years ago said there were 5,000 TCF of gas in Wyoming, so there's no problem with anything anymore. That was an in-place number. Whereas the recoverable, based on all the approximately 80,000 wells that produce, we have an 80 TCF recoverable. It's a more relevant number to us.
But it seems like being explicit about the in place, if it's 5,000 TCF and the recovery factor is 0.01%.
And we don't do it. We just don't do it that way. That's why. In fact, that's why I wanted to show you our methodology, because that always comes up.
So it does sound like Carnage.
Take one more question before we move on.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I was just wondering, for emerging shale plays that are probably hard to figure, Lafayette or
The Fayetteville, yeah.
what's your approach there to ensure you pull it all in and get a reasonable?
And again, this gets right back to what John was saying, and that's it takes time. You have to have, in our case, either wells within a play or an analog play that you believe in. So, for instance, when we assessed the Woodford Barnett and the Permian to Delaware just a few months ago, do you believe that the Woodford Barnett or the Barnett in the Fort Worth Basin is a geologic analog? So we thrashed through that for weeks. Is it a proper analog? Can we use those EUR distributions to assess the Permian Basin? And it turns out we said we can't use it directly. So there's a lot of that geologic discussion goes on and how you decide whether a gas shale play has the same potential as some analog. It's not easy, and that's why I try and get these guys to put as big a range as possible on these numbers, just for that reason, because we just don't know. But we try and catch them. Some we miss. We missed the Barnett in '95. In 2001, we missed the Utica Shale play in the Appalachian Basin, which now has a handful of wells in it. So, you know, we try not to miss them, but we do. You know.
Well, that's it. Chris actually has a flight to catch, so thank you for being here. Okay. Moving right along, we have Mr. George Einan. He's the Vice President of Business Development and External Relations at the Canadian Energy Research Institute, that's CERI. Previously, he was a Senior Director of Research with CERI, where he ran the Institute's natural gas program, so CERI has lots of experience and knowledge to share with us today. Since we're sort of short on time, I'm going to be very brief on the bios from here on out, and I'll let you go ahead and take the floor.
Thank you. You may notice a similarity, apart from the large shock of hair, between myself and the previous speaker. My daughter thought that all geologists had beards when she was quite small, because all my friends were geologists and every one of them had beards, and we all had funny accents, like the Boston one you just heard, and mine, and Newfoundland, and so on. But all geologists don't have beards, but a large number of us do. I'm going to swap this back. I'm going to talk mostly about Western Canada, because that's where most of the resources are. And I'm going to give you some history, because I think it's necessary to understand how we got to where we are, what's happened most recently, and what's likely to happen in the future. Otherwise, without the history, I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense. You need to also understand some significant differences between the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin and a number of other basins, and I'll walk through some of those. And I'll finish up with some of the demand side elements that we touched on already when someone asked Roland George about natural gas use for the oil sands, for example, and also some of the other resources besides Western Canada. I won't bore you with what we do at Canadian Energy Research Institute, but it's sort of the obligatory thing my boss makes me put up each time, so I'll put that up. We do spend a lot of time on education and working with the media and the public, which I think is important. We are an independent, objective group that's funded by both industry and government, so we can provide, we can piss them both off, actually, when we works quite well that way. I borrowed this slide from a previous existence. I worked for CERA for about 5 years, and at the time generated some of these graphics to show the magnitude of basins and the size of them, and the circle there shows the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin and the magnitude of the resources, or rather the supply in TCF a year from there, and it's comparable to any of the basins throughout North America at the time, splitting the Gulf Coast onshore and offshore separately, of course. But it's a major supply of gas in the North American marketplace. I'm just going to go back to that. We had a talk, a session internally recently about the geopolitics of energy and natural gas as a geopolitical tool. And being something of a realist, I try to point out that we only have one neighbor. And when you're already friendly with that neighbor, it's not much use as a geopolitical tool, not like, as somebody mentioned earlier, the Russians. We are a lot more friendly than that, I think, and closer. So what I want to start off with is looking at how natural gas production in Canada has changed over the last while, and taking it back to the 80s. And somebody talked about earlier about deregulation finally in the mid 80s. Once that deregulation occurred, natural gas took off, and I'm going to show you why here in this diagram. Similar time period, chugging along at about 3 TCF a year for domestic consumption, and a complete restraint on exports because they had to have about 25 years of reserve backing. Reserve or resource backing, I'm not quite sure which, but reserve backing to get any export permits. Once that was relaxed in the mid-80s, of course, we really had an enormous inventory to work off. So we were able to come from the 3 TCF a year and grow this up to about 6 TCF a year. But we took our RP ratio, the reserves to production ratio, down from about 25 to 30, down to 10 or less now as we worked it off. So we essentially had discovered a lot of resources, if you will, even if they weren't proven reserve, but then we're able to work those off over the last 20 years. Got up to that point at the top there at the end of the decade, and we've been unable to grow the production since. And in fact, what we've really been talking about for Western Canada in particular, and a number of mature basins in the U.S., is basins that are on a natural gas supply treadmill, if you will. You've got to run fast just to stand still, and I'll explain that in some detail here. I haven't gone into too much engineering detail. Lot more activity, lower rates of production, and smaller reserves per well. And we've also seen with the prices increasing that costs have increased as well as elements of the factors of production have taken out chunks of that economic rent. I'm going to talk about the regulatory and royalty changes that we're seeing in Alberta, because those were mentioned earlier with the royalty review program and its impacts. And some questions about how the industry is going to go about meeting those challenges. Our previous premier of Alberta was Ralph Klein, and he was the one that said up in the top corner there, the treadmill's a good machine for politicians because you run like hell and you get nowhere. In fact, they were, and this is one of the original treadmills from Brixton Prison, which is not far from where I grew up. But it's basically two competing forces. You're producing the wells, you're losing production because the wells are producing and there's a decline rate, and then you're trying to replace it with the rate additions, the new wells and the rate per well. And I'm going to describe this same diagram. I'll show up 2 or 3 times here in the next little while with some different notes on it. It's critical to understand that in the early 90s we were tracking along where the number of wells we were drilling and the growth rate in production was essentially matching. And in the mid-90s, it got to the point where we could still continue to grow the production in Western Canada, in the basin. It's a very well-endowed basin, probably the size of the whole Rocky Mountain province in the U.S., so that the production in red continues to grow. But what we see is the wells required to maintain that production rate increased dramatically. And the last speaker talked about the number of wells that were going to have to be done for the continuous drilling, for the continuous resources. These were at this stage still conventional resources, but lower productivity. And that's the third element in here. The blue line, you can see that the million a day on the left-hand side per new well added has reduced over time to less than 500,000 a day. And in fact, as that's gone into the future, that number, the wells have continued to skyrocket in terms of the number of wells required in the basin just to stay flat with production, and the production per well has decreased. So that's the critical problem in a mature basin like Alberta, like the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. So if you aggregate all that and look at what's added each year in black, or rather, if you go from the top of any one column, the red on say 1995, and go down to the top of the pink on the ensuing column, that's the amount of production lost, shown in the black on top of the pink in the next year. And only if that's exceeded do you get another increase. And you can see that throughout that period of time through the 90s, we were able to continue to increase production in the basin. Since then, however, we've been struggling just to maintain production and replace the resources. And it's meant that we've had to bring on stream not the 1 BCF a day that we had to in the 90s, new production, or even the doubling of that by the mid-90s, but now 3 to 4 BCF a day to bring on stream each year just to replace the production from that year. And that's becoming a monumental task. If you take into account the decline in the productivity, you require more and more wells. And that's what's happening. So this just shows, isolating those rate additions without the deciding whether there's any growth or not, but looking at the rate additions, you're looking at about 3 to 3.5 BCF a day of additional production each year being put on stream with new wells, but that's merely replacing what's being produced. And the number of wells, the event count there, has increased enormously and continues to increase. Well, would continue to increase if it wasn't for some issues we'll look at currently. The other thing is that these wells, excuse me, the wells that were in existence prior to 1990 have been declining all this time, and much like those, what John called his thousands of crappy wells, they continue to produce. It's just that they're towing out here. The asymptote is coming down, and they're producing, and they will continue to produce for some great length of time. But most of the production now comes from wells that were drilled since then. In fact, if you look at something like this, probably 50 or 60% of the current production comes from wells drilled in the last 3 years. And that's quite similar in basins around the US as well. So it's recent production that is really replacing that your production. It's recent additions that are replacing that production, and then they start to decline quite rapidly before they tow out as well. And you can see it in terms of the productivity classes. Each line represents a set of wells that are at a production level. All the ones at the bottom here, the higher the individual production, the fewer there are of the wells. So that's why it's running along relatively flat, and the fewer event counts there are per class. But when it comes to the shallow, low productivity wells, in this case less than 500,000, those are the ones that are increased. Those are the ones that almost dominate that previous one I showed you with the event count. And for deliverability, you can almost read depth here, because it's the thousands and thousands of shallow wells that are being drilled that are making up most of that green line. That's illustrated from a map point of view. This is a period of time. I borrowed this from another consultant in Calgary who works with us at the time, but Forward Energy, Dave Flint. This shows all the wells or townships that had wells in them that produced of a given level, and the levels are shown on the right there. And the blue ones are the ones that are the very bottom, less than 500,000 a day, are shown as low deliverability. 37% of the rate additions in terms of so only 37% is coming from those thousands and thousands of wells. The other 60+% has to come from the higher productivity ones. And over this period of time, which was 3 years, 2003 to 2005, some 42,000 completions were put on stream over that period of time from these shallow wells. If you look at the other end, the pieces that were shown there in the circles, very, very few at the other end of the scale. Very few in the greater than 4 million a day. In fact, 240-something zones connected. So the very, very high-level ones, high-rate ones, do add reserves, but there's not very many of them, and you have to rely on a tremendous amount of drilling in order to keep this productivity of the basin up. Just gives you some idea of this magnitude. Now, for conventional here, you could for unconventional here, you could almost read continuous, but it also includes the very shallow wells, the very shallow drilling on the unconventional side. You can see that unconventional activity, as it's often designated, is already 33% of the production out of the Alberta Basin, out of the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin. I think in the US it's already over 40%, that the non-conventional production. So we're following along. You can see how thin our little shale piece is and how small our CBM areas are. They haven't grown to the extent yet that they have in the US. And to be perfectly honest, the tax breaks in the 90s that developed the technology for coal bed methane, for example, were applied to the simpler and easier basins, and now with technology improvements, we've taken advantage of that R&D and applied it in Western Canada, and we're beginning to put a fairly significant coal bed methane and shale gas piece together as well. What I want to do at this stage, though, is talk about some differences in the basin. This basin is north of 49 degrees and up past 60 degrees in terms of latitude. That has some differences and some, certainly when I had to scrape the ice off my car early yesterday morning to drive to the airport, and I didn't have to do that this morning with my window at the hotel, there are some significant differences by being at different latitudes. I want to talk about rig utilization and the rig cycle on an annual basis. The top line is the increase in the rig fleet in Western Canada, and it's grown from somewhere around 650, 660 at the beginning of January, beginning of 2002, to something close to 900 rigs available in Western Canada now. And what we've seen, though, is a fluctuation all the time around an annual cycle. Obviously, there are periods where it's low activity and high activity. Now, unlike not parts of the northern states, when the ground freezes in Alberta and BC and Saskatchewan, all the drillers get really excited and rush out and get all their rigs working. So all the peaks, ironically, are when the ground's frozen, because they can now get around the countryside. The low immediately after it is called breakup. It's literally the ground thaws and they can't move for goodness knows how long. And then it picks up again through the summer piece and you hit another winter peak. So that pattern recurs every year. But you can also see that in the last 2 or 3 years we've had something else happening. And we've seen in the winter of 06, winter of 07, I guess, we saw a huge reduction in drilling activity. And it was predicated not on the threat of the new royalty regime that was coming out, because that hadn't yet been dreamt of. This was something that someone, probably Roland, referred to earlier. Despite the price of gas being relatively high, the economic rent was almost completely taken up by higher costs. The labor issues, the day rates for rigs, materials, equipment were harder to get a hold of. We're in a relative economic boom in Western Canada where, with the oil sands going 10 billion plus investment every year on oil sands, the Olympics in Vancouver, another 10 billion a year on infrastructure, tremendous pressure on resources, those factors of production in the gas side, in any economic activity. So we saw the industry say we can't afford to drill at this kind of price, and put most of that pressure, I think, really on the rig rates, because that had been the piece to them that they can control. We've seen the rig rates now as a result of 2 years of backing off activity, that rig rates are actually coming back down, and the amount of decrease has slowed, and while it's going to be another decrease coming this winter in terms of absolute drilling, it looks as though it may bottom out and will pick up again, because the price of gas, as somebody pointed out earlier, is quite reasonable. But let me just show you on an annual basis what that impact has looked like. Weeks along the bottom, so January on the left-hand side, December on the right, Christmas on the right. Drilling season is really that January, February, March, ground's frozen. Most of the rigs are active. 80, 90, 95% of the rigs active. Break up, drops right off, and then back up in the summer where you can get in, because some of these places are summer access only. You can't get in the winter access only. You can't get in the summer, and then picking up again towards the next drilling season in the winter. But the critical thing is this year, 2007, because of that cost problem, this unavailability of materials, we're down to below the 5-year average. Well, that's a significant decrease. It hasn't yet turned into a decrease in production and export of natural gas, but this year we may well see half a BCF a day reduction as a cumulative impact, because what happens often is you drill one winter, complete it the next. So we're about to see, I think, some of those impacts in Western Canada. Quick piece on the new royalty framework. The whole issue here was really the economic rent, as we pointed out earlier. And what I'll do here is just simply tell you that they've now put a single graduated sliding scale royalty in, but it's dependent on the productivity of the well, the depth of the well, and of course the market price of natural gas. The shallow rights reversion I'll come back to, but I don't want to let that one escape. So here's what the new royalty schemes look like for 4 representative wells. The old royalty maxed out at 35. Shallow drilling, the 2 black lines are shallow wells, less than 2,500 meters. And I've calculated in for with the price and a less than 2,500 meter depth, couple of lines depending on the rate of the well. A simple, very low productivity, 100 MCF a day well never gets up there. It gets to about 24% royalty and shuts off. It maxes out. A well that's doing 250 MCF a day, which would be a damn good coal bed methane well, so some of the sweeter spots in coal bed methane, would end up getting royalties up to around 43%. Deeper wells with higher productivity, as much as 500,000 a day in case of the small red line and 1 million a day in case of the heavy red line, get up to that max of 50% pretty quickly. In fact, not much above current prices, $9, $10 or $9. So this is certainly going to achieve getting more economic rent in for the Crown, who own the rights. It shouldn't dampen too much of the enthusiasm for the deep wells, the ones that are highly productive, but quite what it'll do for the low productivity wells and the companies that work in those areas, I'm not quite sure. Which takes me back to that shallow rights reversion line that was the bottom of the last chart. What they've been threatening to do for probably a decade or more has been if you aren't producing the natural gas you've discovered, it would revert back to the Crown and be released. So what we are anticipating here over the next little while is that tremendous areas of the province in terms of the shallow zones above current production will eventually, and it may take 3, 4, 5 years, eventually return to the Crown and be released at Crown sales. And it may well provide the fillip to these junior companies who are having a tough time right now to re-enliven them, because this is the province of the little guy, the mom and pop shop, the individual entrepreneur and the small companies. They can get in and do some of these things at fairly low cost. There are some large companies going in and taking a hard look at some of these plays that cover large areas too, so it won't just be the small companies, I'm sure. A quick note about other supplies. I'm going to wrap up here in just a second. There's obviously supplies from the East Coast. We've just seen a new arrangement between the Nova Scotia government and the Deep Panuke, and that may now move ahead. This is a discovery that had been made on the Scotian Shelf that hadn't been hooked up yet. Obviously, the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline will have a major impact down the road in terms of resources from the Mackenzie Valley itself and then from the Beaufort Sea, Mackenzie Delta. The Arctic Islands, we were talking about LNG earlier into the North American marketplace. In fact, there's 10 TCF already discovered, probably hundreds of TCF in the Arctic Islands that could in fact be moved around the east to the East Coast and delivered into the East Coast facilities that are being built in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick as we speak. Actually, only one of them is currently being built in New Brunswick, I think. And then there's demand from the oil sands, and I will skip over a bunch of slides that show the magnitude of that because we have talked about it, but I will show. That's just to prove we're next to Saudi Arabia with you guys. And in fact, we've got twice as much of that in terms of not proven oil, but established reserves. We just recently looked at the likely gross bitumen production from the oil sands over time, given the current projects that have been announced. And we put in all sorts of either delays or double delays or even reductions of total. And if you take the most likely is probably with some delays here. So keep the red line in the heavy red line in mind. You can get up to 6 million barrels a day of bitumen production by 2030. Now that, if you now take again the heavy red line is the natural gas use for that, and it gets up to over 5 BCF a day if all the projects that go ahead are all using natural gas. Now that's not a given, but a lot of them are already using natural gas. And if that were the case, this is what you would see for natural gas usage. For mining and extraction isn't a big deal. You don't use a lot of gas for that. But the in situ operations, when you've got to have high pressure steam in the ground to move this bitumen, to heat it up and move it, huge. And also the upgrading piece where you're going to crack that bitumen into a synthetic crude oil. And 85% of the crude is expected to be turned into synthetic crude oil. The last piece is around what the alternatives are in using that gas, and we mentioned them earlier. The whole idea of coal, particularly pet coke and asphaltenes being used, and then the whole idea of using the bitumen itself in an emulsion to use that to create the steam and electricity. I'm going to have to stop in terms of these other pieces that are likely to reduce that very large gas use in the oil sands, because it will be a considerable reduction, but these are the pieces that are going to do that. I apologize for taking a little more than my allotted time. Thank you.
Okay, given the time, I'm going to actually ask you to refrain from asking questions until both Juan and myself have already made our presentations. Next up is Juan Rosellón. He's a professor at CDE and a research associate at Technical University in Dresden. He is holds a PhD from Rice University. So welcome back, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really glad I'm back here at Rice. It's always a pleasure to be back here. And I have to tell you that this will not be a presentation that has anything to do with geology. I'm not a geologist, I'm an economist. So my presentation will be radically different to what we have seen, because I will be trying to give you an idea on what were the fundamentals from the point of view of the regulatory economics theory that motivated the regulatory reform in Mexico. So this approach is done from the point of view of a regulator that is trying to design an adequate regulatory reform that provides incentives to invest in the sector. I will be trying to make a summary of all this work that we have done over the years that deal with basically the regulation of the price of natural gas, of domestic natural gas in Mexico, as well as some work that we have done in trying to provide incentives to expand transportation pipelines. As you can see, I have been working very closely with Professor Bob Brito here from Rice and the Baker Institute, but also I will be using other work we've done with other colleagues that do a similar task for the case of natural gas distribution. So I will first give you a brief overview on what was the motivation for the regulatory reform process of the natural gas industry in Mexico, and then tell you some details on how incentive regulation was designed for distribution, transportation, and production. And then I will conclude with some summarizing ideas. I think this presentation will help us to understand why we're getting the results that we're getting that Francisco Salazar presented in the first session. And also let us understand what are the challenges that we have to deal with in Mexico. So the basic idea of the regulatory reform was, as usual, to have a better use of the scarce public resources that we have in Mexico to be invested in the industry. So the basic idea was, well, let's let Pemex invest more in production and development of reserves and keep in good shape the already existing pipeline transportation network of around 9,000 kilometers, and then let private investors to develop the other areas of the system, such as distribution, transportation pipelines, as well as the development of gas marketing activities. And all this took place through a regulatory reform process that implied both decisions on the organization of the industry and also on specific incentive regulation for several variables such as prices and auctions. So this is how the industry looked before 1995, with Pemex as a vertically integrated monopoly. And the idea was to evolve in the long run to this type of industrial organization when we see more competition in other areas. And the idea was that the monopoly of Pemex would be just restricted to production. Along with this long-run vision of the industry, some specific policy decisions were done, such as the granting of exclusivity in distribution and no exclusivity in transportation, also liberalization of the international trade and the elimination of import tariffs, the allowance of some vertical integration given that new competitors would be dealing with an already existing powerful incumbent, which is, of course, Pemex. Also, the liberalization of marketing activities so that no permit was needed to operate marketing, the regular open access clauses to transportation and storage, as well as for distribution, where commercial bypass was implemented from the first day of operations, and likewise the design of price regulation, incentive price regulation, in distribution, transportation, and in production, where we use an international yardstick regulation, which is based in the price in Southeast Texas, in fact, in the Houston Ship Channel. So let me give you some details on how the regulatory reform process was designed for distribution, transportation, and production. I will start with distribution. I have also, I need to tell you that I will be dealing with technical aspects. Sometimes I will have to present some equations and models. I apologize for that. I will try just to go briefly through them and try to give you the main idea of the models and the methods that we use in Mexico. So the regulatory reform process in distribution combined the design of auctions for exclusivity in the distribution geographical areas. This was then a process of competition for the market that granted low tariffs for consumers, as well as incentives to regulate the distribution tariffs, and all this in order to attract investment to greenfield projects. In Mexico, we didn't have an experience, or we didn't have previous LDC projects, local distribution company projects, and therefore the regulation had to consider that very much. So the auction design basically tried to reach a trade-off between the management of risk through the granting of exclusivity and incentive provision to cost minimization through an implicit competition between the local distribution company and the transportation subsidiary of Pemex through the implementation of a policy on the granting of physical bypass, so that during the first stages of the projects, only the large consumers could get that physical bypass. Now, the design of price regulation also tried to reach a balance between the attraction of investment to those greenfield projects through the use of average revenue incentive regulation, and likewise, consumer surplus maximization through the use of tariff basket incentive regulation, and also through the process of competition for the market. So let me give you more details. And distribution dividends grant 12-year distribution exclusivity. As I said, average revenue regulation was used or is used during the first 5-year period, and afterwards tariff basket is used. One specific aspect of the way distribution tariffs are set in Mexico is that they have to be set, at least at the beginning of the projects, in terms of a forecast of the volume. And this was done because there was no previous experience on distribution projects in Mexico. And also, there is a need of a correction factor, the famous K factor, to adjust for these estimation errors. Now, let me go more deeply into why this regulation was designed in this way. Together with the analysis of the international experience, also the literature on economics regulation establishes that whenever you have stability in a system, when there is stability in cost and demand functions and myopic profit maximization, the use of a certain type of weights for relative prices grants convergence to the Ramsey price equilibrium. This just tells us that when you have a stability in the system and you use, in this case, previous periods outputs as weights, which are the Chain-Las Perez weights, then you get convergence to a welfare maximizing equilibrium. But when you don't have that, then even the Las Perez weight or other type of weights, such as the average revenue weight, won't grant convergence to the Ramsey structure. So this is basically was telling us that when there was a stability after the first 5 years of operations, then the Chain-Las Perez weights should be used, and afterwards, then the tariffs would converge in the long run to the Ramsey pricing equilibrium. However, during the initial stages of the project, the use of average revenue regulation was recommended because it is a softer constraint than the Chain-Las Perez index. By the way, the average revenue regulation is a kind of regulation where the weights for relative prices are not fixed. They are endogenous, they are variable, and therefore, as it is shown in the literature, represents a softer constraint for profit maximization. So this was the basic motivation for setting up that kind of a structure for regulation of distribution tariffs in Mexico. However, there was still a question on what would be the effects of average revenue regulation and the competition for the market process on consumer surplus, and we answered to that question in a paper we published a while ago, where we show that with this type of combination of different regulatory methods, the auction, average revenue regulation, tariff basket, we will have consumer surplus increases when the firm is risk averse and there is more demand uncertainty. So this is telling us that the type of regulatory scheme that we designed provided incentives to make a rapid connection of consumers and develop the systems. So as Francisco presented in his presentation this morning, he was telling us that one of the biggest successes of the reform was precisely the attraction of investment to distribution. So this is more or less giving the fundamentals for that result. Okay, so I'll skip that and go into transportation directly. Here, as Francisco was also telling us, the reform only provided like a general framework of using incentive regulation to develop transportation networks. But still, the details have to be developed. and we're working on that. And the point, the first real important thing is that we have Pemex vertically integrated, and that problem is a big one, at least from an analytical point of view, because any type of vertically integrated monopoly would have incentives to congest the pipeline network so as to get congestion rents, to evade price regulation, and also to deter the entrance of competitors in transportation and marketing activities. So this is a big problem that has to be solved. It's not easy to be solved because there is a lot of political content in it, but that's something that is there and needs to be addressed. Now, let's assume for a moment, let's dream about it, that there is vertical disintegration and that Pemex is vertically disintegrated. So still we have to deal with the problem of regulating a natural monopoly. And there are two approaches to deal with this issue. The first one that we're working on is very similar to what Francisco was telling us before. Try to see the problem from the point of view of consumers. The point is when consumers would be willing to pay for the expansion of capacity. And analytically, the problem is to see what are the effects of constraint in capacity. So this is like a typical chart of the effects of a capacity constraint. And you can see here that we have congestion rents and a congestion cost, and the idea is that a regulator would like to minimize that area. And that is, sorry for this, I will just briefly explain. This would be this term in here is this rectangle, sorry, this triangle. This term in here is this rectangle, and this other term in here is the saving operating costs. That would be obtained whenever you, when consumers pay for the expansion of capacity or, for example, build a parallel line to already existing line. So the objective of a regulator would be to minimize this function, this welfare loss function, and the choice variable would be the optimal time of investment. And this is an explanation on how this works. For example, this is an example for a 48-inch pipeline, 300 miles long, with a 30% rate of return. Consumers would be willing to pay for the expansion of capacity if we give equal weight to everything in the welfare loss function. They will be willing to pay for the expansion of capacity in approximately 2 weeks. So this type of analysis is telling us that the fundamentals of the decisions on having consumers paying for the expansion of capacity is adequate, at least from an analytical point of view. The other approach is what we have right now, which is trying to use a cap on two-part tariffs and using the rebalancing between both parts of the tariff to provide incentives to invest in the system. So I have to move on. I have only 5 minutes more. So let me finish up a little bit with production and how the incentive regulation was designed, and we will see what are its effects. So in production, price regulations seek to provide incentives for productive efficiency by making Pemex another competitor in the North American natural gas market. And this was basically achieved by using the proposal made by Little Mirrlees back in the 60s, which in terms of the pricing of domestic natural gas in Mexico is equivalently to setting the price of Mexico in terms of its opportunity cost of using it in Mexico rather than exporting it to the US. So the idea basically is to take the price in Southeast Texas and then add net transport cost to the place where most gas is produced in Mexico. So you take the price here in Houston and then add up the net transport costs all the way back here to Ciudad Pemex. And that is setting the price in Mexico. What are the effects of this formula? Well, first of all, in an Energy Journal paper, we showed that this type of formula coincides with the objectives of a regulator that maximizes welfare subject to resource constraints in the pipeline network. However, this regulation also presents a problem in its structure of incentives because Pemex has incentives to decrease investment in gas production and processing, even to flare gas, and to deviate production from the regulated market to its own internal market. And so as to bring the arbitrage point and get more than proportional rents due to that decrease in the location of the arbitrage point. Likewise, Pemex has incentives to congest transportation pipelines to increase domestic natural gas price, as well as to strategically use the pipeline capacity to preserve its monopoly in gas marketing and evade the netback price regulation. So the proposals that we did and that were implemented by the regulator were firstly, a close regulatory monitoring of Pemex production, processing, and gathering activities, and also of its flaring activities. Likewise, fixing the arbitrage point, but this was a short-run proposal, but the idea was to fix the arbitrage point at a level that forces Pemex to increase production and investment, and also having Pemex being charged for the gas it uses and the gas it flares, and likewise enforce the open access to gas pipelines and investment in the network. Of course, again, another big problem is Pemex vertical integration. We proposed an equivalent measure, which was not letting Pemex market gas inside of Mexico, but that was not feasible in terms of public policy due to political reasons. Okay, so I have to finish up, and just my conclusion would be that some of the lessons that are obtained from the process of regulatory reform in Mexico are firstly that decisions on industry structure and vertical integration are very important in order to define a level playing field for all market players, as we are seeing that in practice. And the other issue is that regulation, all this mixture of regulations, could be used in order to reach an equilibrium in at least two trade-offs, related trade-offs, which are the management of risk vis-a-vis incentives in regarding cost minimization, and likewise the trade-off between the attraction of investment and maximization of consumer surplus. And I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, since we are running about 15 minutes into our lunch, and I think the food has actually already been delivered, I'm going to make an adjustment to the schedule. What I will do is actually, right after lunch, when we reconvene, I'll present the results of the study that there's a copy of out there on the table, and then we'll hand the program over to the next panel. So I'm looking for Michelle because she's actually chairing the next panel. But anyway, at that point, she'll take over and we'll move on from there. So if there are any questions, we're going to take a couple of minutes for questions. If not, we can just go ahead and break for lunch. All right. Thank you. Lunch.